The storm had already left. People in the Virginia mountains went to sleep on August 19th believing the danger had passed. The hurricane had weakened. The wind was gone. By dawn, over 150 of them were dead. The water came in the dark, hours after everyone thought they were safe. Hurricane Camille made landfall on the Mississippi coast on August 17, 1969. The wind destroyed everything it touched. Wind speeds exceeded 200 miles per hour. The storm surge reached 24 feet. Entire coastal communities were erased. Then the storm moved inland and weakened rapidly. By the time it crossed into Virginia, it was no longer a hurricane. The threat appeared to be over. In the mountains of Nelson County, Virginia, people had watched the news about the coastal destruction. But they were 300 miles from the Gulf of Mexico. The Appalachian Mountains had always protected them from coastal storms. The storm that reached them had no destructive wind. The trees were still standing. Power lines remained intact. There were no evacuation orders. No warnings suggested they were in danger. Some residents had left as a precaution when they heard the storm was tracking inland. Most stayed. They had lived through storms before. By the evening of August 19th, those who had evacuated began returning home. The storm had passed through. The worst was clearly over. Life resumed. People went to bed in houses that had stood in those valleys for generations. Some had been built in the 1800s. They had survived every storm that had ever crossed Virginia. The National Weather Service had issued flash flood watches, but these were routine for heavy rain. No forecast suggested what was actually happening in the mountains above them. The meteorological models of 1969 could not predict the interaction between tropical moisture and mountain terrain. No one understood the scale of water that was accumulating. The danger everyone had prepared for was over. The danger no one anticipated was already underway. Camille's remnants stalled over the Blue Ridge Mountains on the night of August 19th. The storm circulation collapsed, but the moisture did not dissipate. It concentrated over a small area of central Virginia and remained stationary for hours. The conditions were perfect for extreme precipitation. Warm, saturated air was forced upward by mountain terrain. It cooled, condensed, and fell as rain. Then more air moved in behind it, and the process repeated continuously. Rain fell at rates that exceeded measurement capacity. Estimates suggest over 600 millimeters fell in less than 8 hours across Nelson County. Some locations may have received twice that amount. One rain gauge recorded 700 millimeters before it failed. Another was found a quarter-mile downstream from where it had been installed. The actual totals remain unknown because the instruments could not survive the event they were meant to measure. There was no wind, no lightning, no thunder, just rain falling in absolute darkness at a rate rarely observed anywhere on Earth. The sound was constant but gave no indication of accumulation. People inside their homes heard rain on the roof. It was heavy rain but not unusual for Virginia in late summer. They did not hear the water rising around them. They could not see what was happening outside. The rain was warm, the air was still. There were no visual cues of danger. Flashlights revealed only rain falling straight down, no horizontal movement, no debris. Nothing to suggest the water was not simply draining away as it always had. Some people looked outside and saw rain. They went back to bed. The precipitation rate in some areas exceeded 100 millimeters per hour. At that rate, the ground cannot absorb anything. The water has nowhere to go but downhill. The Blue Ridge Mountains are old. The rock beneath Nelson County was formed over 1 billion years ago. The slopes are steep. The soil layer is thin. In most places, bedrock sits less than a meter below the surface. The forests hold the soil in place, but they cannot hold water. When rain falls on flat ground, it pools. It infiltrates slowly. It spreads horizontally. But on slopes exceeding 30 degrees, water does not pool. It moves immediately. Gravity pulls it downhill faster than the soil can absorb it. The steeper the slope, the faster the movement. Nelson County's slopes average 40 degrees. Some exceed 60. The soil became saturated within the first hour of heavy rain. After that, every additional drop became runoff. 600 millimeters of rain across steep terrain does not soak in. It flows. The water moved downslope in sheets, gathering speed and volume. Small streams became rivers. Dry hollows became torrents. The mountains functioned as a collection system. Every ridge channeled water into the valleys below. The valleys were narrow. The water had nowhere to spread. It concentrated into existing waterways. The Ty River, the Rockfish River, Davis Creek, Muddy Creek, dozens of smaller tributaries with no names, all of them converged. The vegetation could not slow the water. Tree roots stabilized soil under normal conditions, but these were not normal conditions. The force of the runoff exceeded the holding capacity of the root systems. Trees were undermined. Soil liquefied. Entire slopes began to move. Landslides started on the higher elevations first. The soil slid over the bedrock beneath it. Everything on the surface moved downhill as a coherent mass. Trees, boulders, topsoil. The slides followed the natural drainage paths. They merged with the water already flowing in the streams. The water was no longer just water. It was a slurry of mud, rock, and wood moving at high speed. The physics were simple. Steep terrain plus extreme rainfall equals mass movement. The mountains were not absorbing the storm. They were channeling it. The Ty River under normal conditions was shallow. You could wade across it in most places. It drained a watershed of about 150 square kilometers. The valley it flowed through was narrow. Steep ridges rose on both sides. The river had carved that valley over millions of years, but it had never carried the volume of water that entered it on the night of August 19th. The water arrived from every tributary simultaneously. Streams that normally carried a few cubic meters per second were now carrying hundreds. They emptied into the Ty River from both sides. The river rose vertically. There was no gradual flooding, no slow encroachment. The water level increased by meters within minutes. Eyewitnesses who survived reported the sound, a roar that grew louder. Then the water arrived as a single wave. It was not a flood in the traditional sense. It was a moving wall of water and debris traveling down a confined channel at extreme velocity. The wave carried everything the slopes had released: trees 30 meters tall, boulders weighing tons, houses that had been ripped from their foundations upstream, cars, propane tanks. The debris acted as battering rams. The valley offered no escape routes. The roads ran parallel to the river. When the river rose, the roads disappeared underwater. The bridges went first. They were not designed for this. The water pressure was too great. The debris impacts were too forceful. Bridges collapsed within minutes of the water arriving. Anyone trying to evacuate by car found the roads impassable. The only direction to go was up, straight up the slopes, in the dark, through forest, over terrain too steep to climb easily in daylight. Some people made it. They climbed until they were above the water line and held onto trees until morning. Others did not make it far enough. The water rose higher than anyone anticipated. Houses that sat 15 meters above the normal river level were submerged. Davis Creek behaved the same way. So did the Rockfish River. Every waterway in Nelson County became a high-velocity debris flow. The narrow valleys amplified the effect. Water that might have spread across a wide floodplain had nowhere to spread. It stayed concentrated. It stayed fast. The water peaked around midnight. By then, entire communities along the rivers had been destroyed. Houses were gone, not damaged, gone. The foundations remained. Everything else had been carried downstream. People who had been inside those houses were carried downstream with them. Some survived by chance. A wall collapsed outward instead of inward. A roof held together long enough to float. A tree stopped moving and provided something to hold onto. But chance was rare. Most people in the path of the water did not survive. The rain stopped before dawn. The water began to recede as quickly as it had risen. By first light, the valleys were no longer submerged, but they were unrecognizable. The landscape had been reshaped. Roads were buried under meters of debris. Bridges existed only as fragments. Fields were covered in mud and boulders. Trees were stripped of bark and jammed against anything still standing. Survivors emerged into daylight and found that their neighbors' homes were missing. Not collapsed, missing. A house that had stood 50 meters away was gone entirely. The foundation was there. Everything else had been removed. Some survivors did not know yet that the people inside those houses were dead. They assumed evacuations had happened. They were wrong. Communication was gone. Phone lines were down. Roads were impassable. No one could call for help. No one outside the area knew what had happened. The scale of the destruction was not understood for hours. The first responders who reached Nelson County that morning thought they were responding to typical flood damage. They were not prepared for what they found. Bodies were found downstream. Some were miles from where they had been when the water hit. Others were found in debris piles, wrapped in tree branches and mud. Some were never found. The official death toll in Virginia was 123. The actual number is likely higher. Entire families disappeared. There was no one left to report them missing. The survivors described the same thing. They had gone to sleep believing the storm was over. They woke to the sound of water. By the time they understood what was happening, there was no time to react. The people who survived were the ones who happened to be in houses that were positioned slightly higher, or who woke earlier, or who made the decision to climb in the dark. Small differences in timing determined who lived. Rescue efforts were delayed by the destruction of infrastructure. Helicopters could not land. Ground vehicles could not reach the affected areas. Responders had to hike in. It took days to reach some of the remote hollows. By then, there was no one left to rescue. The work shifted to recovery. The scope became clear slowly. Over 150 dead across Virginia. Entire valley communities erased. Hundreds of homes destroyed completely. Thousands left homeless. The damage was not from wind. It was not from storm surge. It was from rain falling on terrain that could not absorb it. The disaster happened after the hurricane had already dissipated. Hurricane Camille killed more people inland than it did on the coast. The wind at landfall was the strongest ever recorded. The destruction on the Gulf was catastrophic, but the death toll in Virginia exceeded the death toll in Mississippi. The flood happened in the mountains, far from the ocean, hours after the storm had weakened. The event changed how meteorologists understood tropical systems. The danger was not just at landfall. The danger continued as long as the moisture remained. Inland flooding became a recognized threat. Forecast models were updated to account for terrain interaction. Warnings began to include post-landfall risks. The term flash flood had existed before Camille. The understanding of what it meant changed after Nelson County. Flash floods were not slow-rising water. They were rapid-onset, high-velocity events with no warning time. The word flash was literal. The time between the start of dangerous conditions and the arrival of deadly water could be measured in minutes. Building codes in mountain regions were revised. Structures were no longer approved for construction in narrow valleys adjacent to steep slopes. Flood zone maps were redrawn. Areas that had never flooded in recorded history were reclassified as high risk. The assumption that safety returned after a storm passed was corrected. The storm itself was not the only threat. The water the storm produced remained dangerous long after the wind had stopped. People in the path of that water were at risk whether the storm was still active or not. Nelson County rebuilt. The valleys were repopulated. New homes were constructed on higher ground, but the old home sites remained empty. The foundations are still there. The communities that existed along the Ty River before August 1969 do not exist anymore. The dead from Camille are not remembered the same way as the dead from coastal hurricanes. There is no footage of the flooding. It happened in the dark in a rural area. No cameras were present. The disaster was discovered after it had already occurred. but the number of people who died in Virginia that night exceeded the number killed by most hurricanes at landfall. The danger was not the storm. The danger was believing the storm was over.